Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. George Holden, who is a professor of psychology at Southern Methodist University. He's a noted expert on parenting, discipline, and family violence. He can discuss social development as it relates to parent-child relationships, the nature and consequences of parents spanking and yelling at children, the causes and consequences of family violence, child rearing and parenting, and child maltreatment. Besides many scientific articles and chapters, he's the author of the book, Parenting, A Dynamic Perspective. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Association, or Society, and he is past president of the Society for the Research in Human Development. We are very excited to have him here with us, so please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks very much, Darsha. This is, I want to thank you and the rest of the organizing committee for this conference. And I must say, I love the title of this conference, Flourishing. Isn't that how we should be oriented, how we can help our children flourish? In the past, it used to be making children competent, and then more recently, we've been moving into well-being. But flourishing, I think, is a wonderful target and goal for us all to be thinking about and working toward. So I commend you, and I hope that term becomes part of our lexicon. I'm happy to share my PowerPoints, so please feel free to email me. My email address will be at the end of the presentation, so you have to hang around at least till then to get my email address. Well, to mix metaphors, this conference certainly has been a marathon, and we're now in the 9th inning, and I'd say 1 out in the 9th inning. But it's been a fascinating, and I've learned so much. I think it's been also a little bit overwhelming, so much information. My talk is going to be fairly simple, I would propose. And I think that I want to make the case that I'm going to present what I consider to be the single most efficacious pathway to help children flourish. And that is through focusing on parenting and through adopting a different orientation that has been called positive parenting. So, let me begin. And let's see, I'm going to go for about 45 minutes. Which clock should I go by? I think that one. Okay, so 30, 40. Okay, so, okay. Here we go. What I'm going to be talking about is what the heck is positive parenting? And then I'm going to make a dichotomy between what I consider the light form and the strong form. My talk is going to focus on the strong form. Then I'm going to present a little empirical evidence about what really goes on in parents' homes with some audio recordings that I've made. Then we'll back up, look at a little bit, very briefly, some theoretical and historical writings related to this approach. I'll quickly review key processes and techniques involved in positive parenting. I'll talk about what research evidence we have for it. And then I'm going to address what I consider the fundamental challenge of us as a society adopting this approach. So that's my agenda. Okay, what is positive parenting? Well, we read frequently about positive parenting in the research literature, but typically what it consists of is good stuff, admittedly, things like warmth, affection, being sensitive, responsive, involved, monitoring children, all good stuff, admittedly. But that's not really what the idea of, I think, positive parenting is, because, as I'll mention in a second, probably the best example of a positive parenting program, the most well-known, is the Triple P program developed by Sanders in Australia. In contrast, the strong form is really a different orientation and approach to parenting. So it's a very different orientation and approach that has gone by different names. Some people call it positive discipline. Some people call it nonviolent parenting. There's also attachment parenting. And we are fortunate in this room to have some experts and actually the developers and workers in Attachment Parenting International. And I'll request that they do not try to jump up and down if I make a wrong statement during my talk, but to save their comments till the end. Thank you. Okay, so my definition of positive parenting that I'm talking about is a child-rearing orientation that's centered around promoting a loving, cooperative relationship. And that's key, cooperative relationship, respecting the child's individuality, and focusing on guidance, not compliance. And that's fundamentally different from Adrian Peterson and many others in our society, where they adopt much more of a power assertion orientation, where they expect, as a parent, for obedience, control, and if they do not get that obedience, they result to punishment. And in the sad case of Adrian Peterson, about 3 weeks ago, we all know that the child was physically abused from being hit with a switch. So just to highlight the differences between Triple P as representing sort of the positive parenting within the traditional scope and this new positive parenting approach that I'm talking about. The Triple P approach is really a behavior, it's based on Patterson's research in Oregon. It's behavioral in orientation, as opposed to the positive parenting, which is, as I mentioned, relationship-based, focusing on developing cooperative relationships. The target groups are, for positive parenting, really it's all parents and parents-to-be, as opposed to perhaps at-risk parents. The key outcome, I think, for Triple P can be compliance, because they're trying to get parents to be more effective, so they focus on child compliance. Rather, you could argue that for positive parenting, a key outcome is to move parents away from an orientation toward punishment and onto reciprocal cooperative relations. Child age, Triple P is more focused on early years. And in terms of practices, the Triple P is more prescriptive. And I think positive parenting generally depends which flavor you go for, but it's non-prescriptive and it focuses on trying to teach parents how to problem solve in general, not a particular technique to use to get through the day and to get compliance. So let me give you some auditory examples of what I'm talking about. And this is a study that I've spent a few years doing. We managed to get 33 mothers. So it's a tiny sample, but it took about 2 years to collect this sample of 2 to 5-year-olds. And they agreed to wear a digital audio recorder for 4 to 6 evenings, which resulted in about 13 hours of recordings per family. And the first publication of this came out this year. And what we've been focusing on is conflicts, and we find that on average we get about 12 conflicts per hour, conflict episodes, and it ranges from a low of 2.3 per hour to 38 per hour. So we've spent a lot of time in this conference talking about fascinating infant development, but but when the child gets older, there's a lot of new issues to deal with, and with 2 to 5 and 6-year-olds, there's a lot of conflict to deal with. So here is our first example.
Let's get your undies ready. Why are you sucking your fingers? Don't do that, Samantha. You don't do that. I don't know where you saw or where you've seen that. You don't do that. It's not funny. It's not cute. Don't do that. That's gross. You don't wash your hands. Samantha?
Okay, there the mother slapped Samantha on her hand because she was sucking her thumb. A second example. Oops, no.
Stop, boy. Come here. I already told you no. Behind messing with this stove, right? Didn't I tell you no? Stick your hand out. Stick your hand out. Right here. No. No. I'm going to stand it for you this time. In. Oh. Go have a seat.
And a third example. This is the most poignant example because it was a lovely situation ruined by a mom's orientation to control.
And he never failed to tell his friends how splendid he was. I think I look... No, Justin. I think I look especially No, Justin. If you want me to read, stop messing with the pages. Because you're moving...
So Justin was turning the page of a storytime book too quickly for the mom. And so she slapped him. So these parents and virtually all the sample were using a power assertion orientation that's very parent-centered. They are looking for immediate compliance. And at least half of them, we found many examples of using punitive, painful discipline, which Baumrine's defends as discipline, sometimes confrontational or punitive, is required to socialize the child's self-indulgent willfulness. So, let me now shift into a little historical and theoretical background for just a few minutes about this new orientation that, quote, new orientation that I'm labeling as positive parenting, strong form. Plato, I think, alluded to this when he said, "Do not train a child to learn by force or harshness, but direct them to be by what amuses their minds, so that you may be better able to discover with accuracy the peculiar bent of the genius of each." I love that quote, because there he's looking for flourishing in the child, the peculiar bent of the genius in each. We also have Quintillion, who was against corporal punishment and called it a disgrace. Plutarch, children ought to be led by honorable practices by means of encouragement and reasoning. A couple more. John Locke, of course, he said at least children should seldom be corrected by blows, so give him partial credit for being on board. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau in Emile wrote, "The words obey and command will be excluded," in his manual about how to rear children. So he was a clear forerunner of this positive parenting orientation, and I'll mention him again in a minute. And of course, there's many others. Horace Mann, the educator, John B. Watson, and Skinner was against punishment of children and thought it was ineffective. More recent proximal orientations are, of course, John Bowlby, and he has a quote, "The conflict with which humanity is oppressed, that of getting angry with and wishing to hurt the very person who is most loved," I think speaks very much to this issue. But probably the most direct, clearest forefather would be Alfred Adler, the Austrian psychiatrist who was the father of individual psychology, which really tried to recognize the whole person. He is known for his birth order, attention to birth order, and focus on inferiority versus superiority. He was very much interested in equality and also parent education. Even though he didn't really develop it, he left that to Rudolph D Kurz, his disciple who came to the US, also an Austrian, and he wrote a series of books related to rearing children. And so he coined various phrases and pushed cooperation without punishment or reward. And also he had talked about logical consequences, which actually Jean-Jacques Rousseau had talked about previously in Emile. So Dweck recommended parents use encouragement, not praise. So Carol Dweck would approve of that, certainly orientation with her research. Emphasis on the task, doing the task and not the result. Avoiding rewards and punishment. Disinvolvement from conflict, so the parent, when they perhaps became agitated, to remove themselves. And as I mentioned, logical consequences. Okay, more recently, I think Jane Nelson was one of the first people to translate that work into the more popular lay literature, and she's written, well, beginning in 1981, I think she has about 15 different books on positive discipline. Then, of course, William and Martha Sears, who were here, and the related work with parenting, Attachment Parenting International, which is the largest positive parenting organization in the world, I think. Do you accept that? Attachment Parenting International people? Okay, yes. And then one other sort of newcomer in this area who's been working with Save the Children Sweden to use positive, she calls it positive discipline, and she now has this program in, it's a free download book, and she now has training in, I think, 19 countries around the world. So I've been doing some work, a little bit of work with Joan in her efforts to promote positive discipline. Here's a Google Ngram of the use of positive discipline or positive parenting in books that shows a dramatic rise in these terms, which is certainly, I think, a positive development. And here is a graph of books that use the word positive, either discipline or punishment, in their titles. So I, meaning my grad students or undergraduates, dug around and counted up the number of books they could find using that term in the title, and you can see this dramatic increase. The point being that there is, it seems to me, this massive lay movement in the mass media toward this idea of positive parenting, which is very encouraging. Here's actually my favorite cover and title: If Buddha Had Kids, Raising Children to Create a More Peaceful World. Now this title doesn't have the positive in it, but it certainly captures that. And if you expand the idea to capturing books in the lay literature, mass media, that have this orientation of peace, of positivity, even if they don't include that term positive, there's more than 100 books out there now on this topic. So as we sort of reviewed these are the key sort of fundamental processes that are referred to in terms of the processes. Promoting sensitive parenting, which then promotes secure attachments and positive relationships. Structuring the child's environment and his or her life, so it's not unstructured. Recognizing children's perspectives. Promoting cooperative relations. Promoting autonomy in the child. Promoting empathy, certainly. Promoting self-regulation. And promoting problem solving in the family. So these are some of the most commonly mentioned among those many books, key processes operating. And common techniques include being proactive, encouraging the child, using positive timeouts or time in, allowing for logical consequences, avoiding punishments and rewards. So you can see some of Dwecker's themes continuing. Staying calm, not yelling, following through, attending selectively to your child's behavior, apologizing, something a power-assertive parent would not do, and also using humor. Appropriate humor, not sarcastic humor, distinctions made earlier in the conference. So here's a couple of sounds of positive parenting. Interestingly, it was a lot harder to find these examples than the negative examples.
Okay, no jumping because of the neighbors, please.
Okay, you know what? This is going to be a cool one. Ready?
Please be careful.
Oh, how about you just...
Wait, if you hit the ceiling, you're going to knock that stuff down.
Okay, so the kid was jumping around with her brother. It was potentially a dangerous thing, but the mom stayed pretty calm and cool about it and talked about the consequences of the action. And here's another example that was good just until the end. Oops.
We need to finish talking about your behavior. Why were you talking back to Miss Keith?
I don't know.
Don't you know that's not being respectful? Hey, I don't want to see on here that you were talking back again. You know that's something that you're not supposed to do, and whenever you do that, you're going to get in trouble.
So mom was lecturing the child there about behavior, talking back to a teacher, and it was good until the end, but you're going to get into trouble. So that would not be accepted as a positive parenting ending. But otherwise, she did, I think, a good job at being positive with the child as she lectured him. So I've made a case that there's a lot of this in the mass media, a lot of this attention. It's been around for many years. What's the evidence? How much attention has this approach received from developmental psychologists, parenting researchers? Well, first off, there is no randomized controlled trials, something that we want to see as researchers about the effectiveness of it. And this is certainly a big gap that needs to be addressed. There is actually very little research attention that has been devoted to this area. But I have found some, I'm sure there's other examples, and people can let me know other examples they can think of. But one of the earliest ones was Parpel and Maccabee, who promoted this idea of the responsiveness leads to cooperative relationships between parent-child. Brenda Voling has had a couple of papers talking about gentle guidance, very much in line with positive parenting. And Kohanska has a number of papers also about mutually responsive orientation. And these are really directly focused on positive parenting in my book. But there's snippets that they haven't, there's no study yet to test the effectiveness of attachment parenting by randomly assigning to groups and showing that it has terrific effects that I'm sure it does in child flourishing. So that it's high on the list, I think, of things that needs to be done. It's clear to me, looking at the theory, the research, that there's lots of benefits to positive parenting. It certainly will promote secure attachments, development of cooperative relationships. There's evidence that it will be linked to self-regulation. There's a number of studies that show when children experience punitive discipline, they're less likely to develop self-regulation than if they don't receive that punitive discipline. Kaczynski's work on conscience development. All the research related to corporal punishment and harsh punishment is also evidence about the negatives that can result from parents who are in the power assertive orientation, which means that positive parenting parents will have children with fewer problems, probably, and with better physical and mental health. So I think there's lots of strong, at least circumstantial or better evidence, but we're still needing that randomized controlled trial. Let me talk a little bit briefly about now the fundamental challenge that I see, and that is how to transform people's orientations away from this power assertive orientation into the positive parenting. One piece of evidence in the US from child trends is the majority of women and more men believe a child sometimes needs a good hard spanking. And there's lots and lots of examples of other evidence like this. Just to present some new data that I've collected, in fact, we collected this in the past week. Is anyone familiar with MTurk? MTurk is an online subject sample, and you can collect a massive amount of data for pennies, essentially, per subject in virtually overnight. So what we did is, actually, we began with our undergraduate sample, and we collected about 200 undergraduates. And then we collected an MTurk sample of 500 parents. And in this, these are just a couple of general questions about their orientation to discipline and control. So how important is it to discipline a 5-year-old child? And identical means from 1 being not at all important to 5 being very important. And you can see that most people think discipline is very important. Now, we didn't define discipline, but most people will think of discipline as not in the guiding sense, but more in the controlling power assertion sense. A few other questions. How important is it for a 5-year-old child to be obedient? And again, a lot of emphasis on obedience, a lot of beliefs that obedience is very important. How important is it for parents to show a 5-year-old child? We used 5 years sort of as an arbitrary grounding point particularly for the undergraduates, but for a 5-year-old to show that his parent is the boss. And there we're still getting very high ratings. So again, hierarchical orientation, power, control orientation, as opposed to a partnership orientation that Rena talked about on. Dr. Eisler is the official name. Dr. Eisler talked about it in her sort of theory about power and control. So, and I think one more question. To what extent is it possible to raise a 5-year-old child without punishing him or her for misbehavior? And basically the response was quite unlikely, or quite basically quite unlikely to do. Not very unlikely, but quite unlikely. So again, these all point to the fact that we, in general, in our society, are programmed, oriented toward this orientation, toward power, toward dominance of the parent, toward control. So, very briefly, three different studies just to mention about trying to change attitudes and beliefs. This is one that I worked on with Joan Durant, and it was a simple pre-post test design of 337 Canadian parents. Canadian parents are a little more enlightened than American parents, but they were trained in this positive discipline in everyday parenting program, and we found significant decreases in support for corporal punishment, and also, perhaps more interestingly, a decrease in the idea that if there's a conflict, it means child misbehavior. So the parents were beginning to open up and recognize that when a child, quote, misbehaves, perhaps, or sucks her thumb, or approaches a stove, or turns the page of a book, perhaps that's the child expressing his or her autonomy and not an act of misbehavior. Or perhaps it's a sign of lack of neurological development, and they're not able to control themselves like an adult does due to lack of prefrontal cortex development or what have you. So just very briefly, so I can allow a little time for discussion, and then I have to run to catch my plane, I just wanted to mention 2 studies that I've done where we have looked at changing attitudes and beliefs and behavior. And the first one was a simple design where we simply presented information about the negative consequences associated with corporal punishment to parents, and in a very simple fashion, in 2 sentences. This was based on the meta-analysis review by Liz Gershoff in 2002, but enhanced by more recent research studies. And we simply, it actually was a randomized, it was an experiment where we randomly assigned folks into either the corporal punishment condition or a control condition where they read information about daycare. And what we found is that simply by presenting some of the information about the negative consequences associated with corporal punishment, like aggression, like child depression and anxiety, like diminished quality of family interactions, we presented about 6 different types of findings in simply 2 sentences. And then in a pre-post design, we assessed both attitudes and intentions. And we found that there was significant decrease in positive attitudes toward corporal punishment, indicating that some people are not aware of the literature and are likely to begin to shift their attitudes, their beliefs, simply if they can hear about the information. So that's one study. The second study under review is we've tested the effectiveness of a clinical technique, motivational interviewing. And in this study, it was a randomized control study where we randomly assigned moms to either waitlist control or the intervention, where a therapist worked with the parent using this technique called motivational interviewing, where they try to elicit the parent's desire to change their behavior by recognizing the fact that they're having problems in the parent-child relationship. In this case, all the parents used corporal punishment, and they would repeatedly use corporal punishment for the same misbehaviors. So the therapist then was able to help them recognize that they are repeatedly using spanking for the same behavior, and it's obviously not working, and that they need to begin to try out other techniques. So in a 1 to 1.5 hour intervention, we found significant changes both in attitudes, and then a month later, both in attitudes and reported spanking behavior and disciplinary behavior. And the effects that we found were stronger. I don't have a slide of it, but the effects were stronger than any other, quote, intervention in the first one that I used, but also any other intervention we've been able to identify that has targeted trying to change these punitive attitudes or positive attitudes toward physical punishment, such as there's a pediatrician at Vanderbilt named Seth Scholar who has a video intervention called Play Nicely. And then there's been a couple of other efforts to change parents' attitudes using, for instance, one is using story time books. And this approach that using motivational interviewing has a stronger effect size than any of those. The other effort, this is sort of a non-research-based effort, but my involvement and helping to co-found the U.S. Alliance to End the Hitting of Children is designed to try to get the message out that corporal punishment is problematic for lots of reasons, and encourage people to visit the site. And we don't have formal membership at this point, but please look at it, and we do promote positive parenting in the site. But as I was talking at lunch with Darsha, if I really want to get the message out, then maybe I need to start blogging like Darsha does in parenting, Psychology Today, and then there's also some blogs on parenting. But you've been very successful in getting people to read your blogs, so I think that's a great idea of way to get the message out. So, concluding comments. One, I think we all need to promote child flourishing with this new approach, whether it be just supporting programs that are out there, or for researchers, we need to, as I'll mention, we need to begin working in this area to collecting evidence. I'm not sure we got all 3 ones, but I guess these are all important to highlight that. So I'll end with a quote from Frederick Douglass. Even though he didn't frame this as addressing child flourishing per se, it does apply. It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken adults. He put men, but I changed it to adults. So, thank you very much for your time and attention. This is... So there's a few minutes for questions, if anyone has questions.
Richard Bowlby, thank you very much. That was very inspiring. I am concerned about the evidence. We're all struggling with evidence. And I'm concerned about the ethics and the practicality, really, of even thinking about trying to set up a randomly controlled prospective trial to apportion one family to use positive parenting as against the same family, possibly, depending upon the randomization, to be assigned to something quite different. And I don't know that that's really realistic, and I'm concerned about that because we really need the data, but I don't know that it's going to be productive to keep searching in that particular field. That's my thought.
Well, I'm a little more optimistic that it can be done and should be done. I think because it is our strongest source of evidence, that it's the bottom line, we really need that. We can put them on a wait list control, and so we begin with training some parents and then track the other parents who are not yet trained in that technique, and then eventually we can train that other set of parents who have not, and I think that's the most ethically responsible approach. But I think for funders, for the public, we need the randomized controlled trials.
I'm from Scandinavia, which has been mentioned in a quite positive light during the conference. We have outlawed physical or corporal punishment.
Yes.
What about a legal strategy? I mean, a political strategy, which says, you know, would that run against the general mindset of the U.S. American people? It would. I mean,
yes,
it would.
Very much.
It would.
So I didn't hear the question, but the point is that, well, in Sweden, for instance, they banned corporal punishment in all venues in 1979. And I guess your point was that a legislative ban in the U.S. would run against most people's orientation. On the wake of the Adrian Peterson case, I've begun to see commentaries that we as a society need to ban it. And in fact, there's a little piece apparently where I support a ban on Meet the Press. There's a sort of counterpoint, and I think it appeared on Sunday. I haven't seen it yet. But I think the discussion about whether there should be a ban in the US has now begun. And in my view, it can be done state by state, particularly in northern states or northwestern states to begin with. And I think that is an important direction we need to go. As you know, there's 19 states that still allow corporal punishment in public schools in the US. So we're also still working on changing that, and that needs to be legislatively done. So, should we?
Do you have any evidence that punishment via isolation in a timeout is less impactful in a child than a slap on the hand?
Do I have any evidence that punishment
via social isolation, as in a timeout, is less harmful to a child than a slap on the hand? Go to your room versus slap on the hand.
Yeah, the quality of the research evidence out there on sort of effectiveness or consequences is not strong. And in fact, I'd like to use my audio method. If I can figure out a faster way to code it, will be, I think, maybe a good way to begin to get better information. With our audio recording, we did find that physical punishment is ineffective in terms of, I think it was about 70% of the kids were misbehaving within 10 minutes after being physically hit or slapped or what have you. So it clearly wasn't working. Some kids were, as you heard, were very emotionally upset. So if you think about the sort of the neurological and endocrinological, if that's a term, consequence on the child's developing brain and body from these frequent, some are very frequent incidents, there's got to be long-term developmental negative consequences. But on the other hand, development, as we all know, as we've seen, is so multiply determined, and it's hard to isolate any single or series of, let's say, discipline events as a causally related to this negative consequence. So I'm not optimistic that we'd ever be able to pinpoint a negative consequence per se to a particular disciplinary technique.
May I step in? I was wondering if, because both of you seem to have opposing viewpoints on logical consequences, right? Because I think, Marilyn, you said that wasn't a good thing, whereas it's part of your set of characteristics. I'm just wondering if you could define what that means. Maybe the definition matters.
Well, my understanding of logical consequence is let the child learn if he or she wants to do something, assuming it's in a safe kind of situation, like the child doesn't want to wear a coat going outside in the winter. They will learn that it's cold, and in the future they'll want to wear a coat because that is a logical consequence of that act. But you're letting the child, I think it ties into self-determination theory, where it's the idea that children really need to learn on their own and be motivated in terms of deciding for themselves, so supporting their autonomy, and that's going to be a much more effective way of changing behavior than the outside authority telling them how to behave.
I guess I don't disagree if the child is in charge of the logical consequences, like I don't want to wear a coat. Well, okay, and the child goes out and they're cold and they think, Mama, I should have worn a coat. But usually when I see this done, it's an imposition on the child. A child is in a classroom, tips its chair back, logical consequence, you stand. I don't feel any better about that. I don't think it's any less punitive, and I don't think the child has any more autonomy. So I think we somehow have allowed ourselves to lull ourselves into thinking we are not being controlling and punitive because we call it logical or because we use consequences instead of using punishment. So I certainly think going to prison is better than the electric chair in a sense of gradation. But I do have a sense that with many people who use logical consequences are imposing a consequence on a child. It does not give autonomy. It breaks the relationship. And it's not a teaching thing. That's all.
Can I jump in real fast to help you? Jane Nelson separates the two into logical consequences are what you impose, and natural consequences are what are just naturally happen.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, I think it's how it's done, and it can be done punitively, like you suggested, and that would be inappropriate. So thank you for the clarification. Yes, ma'am.
I was thinking about the words discipline and control, and I think you obviously need some kind of boundary. And I think every time you ask the question, do you think children can be brought out without discipline? Every time I wanted to answer, it depends. What do you mean by discipline? And I think for parents, if you want to spread the message, it's quite frightening to imply that you can do whatever you want because there isn't discipline. I'm putting it a bit exaggeratedly, I'm sorry.
Right. Well, typically in America, we think of discipline as the controlling. We don't think of discipline as the guiding, which is really what the important part that I believe is the nature of discipline is guiding. And my sense is what we want to do with child flourishing is guide them in positive trajectories. So I have a little theoretical piece in Child Development Perspectives in 2010, where I talk about how important it is for parents to guide children's trajectories into positive ways, and all children are on multiple trajectories. Children can get off the trajectory on an off-ramp. Perhaps it could be due to a health problem, it could be due to peer relations, it could be due to some trauma. And then it's the parent's job to try to get them back onto the positive developmental trajectory. So I think if we think of shooting for that child flourishing as where we're going, and that parents' job is to guide them, then I think parents will abandon a lot of these little disciplinary incidents. Virtually all of the incidents that I recorded of discipline were trivial, that there was nothing important that parents were reacting negatively to, but they got so worked up over petty things. So if parents can take the long-term perspective that what I need to do with my child is promote this good cooperative relationship above all else and promote their development to find that inner genius in that child, then I think a lot of this getting upset about these minor things would hopefully fall away. So changing parents' orientation to the long-term goal rather than the parent-centered, immediate, obedience-oriented goal would help go a long way.
Yes, I absolutely, I agree with everything you say, but I think it's quite useful for a parent to know that there are boundaries.
Absolutely. And no one no one to my knowledge who talks about positive parenting or positive discipline doesn't believe in firm guidance.
Thank you.
We need to move along. Do you have quick questions?
I can talk to him afterwards.
Well, he has to go. Right?
Okay, well, just the language that is used to describe these things I think is very interesting and culturally determined, and also just like, influences how we conceptualize these, highly, cultural issues. I thought it was interesting that you chose the word hitting rather than spanking for the title of your organization. And a lot of people, they want to make this distinction between, spanking is different than hitting.
Absolutely.
I don't know how that will pan out as far as the effectiveness of the organization. But my question is, regarding the use of the term positive parenting, I've also alternatively heard peaceful parenting, nonviolent parenting. These are subjective terms. And I wonder why, in your mind, the migration away from the Baumrein's, parenting styles of authoritative parenting, or even just evidence-based parenting, because they're more descriptive. Is this a sort of public relations thing in your mind, or is there actually a difference?
Well, Baumrein still subscribes to the power assertive orientation. So even though she promotes her authoritative orientation, so the warmth, reasoning, but also she defends corporal punishment as an important tool in the parental toolkit of parenting. So Baumrein's not in the enlightened camp of the positive parenting, in my view. So she's still a pro-power assertion hierarchy. She believes in that hierarchy. Where did she? Well, she actually did her longitudinal studies in the 60s in Northern California and found these, but that's an aside, we won't go there. Okay.
So I just had a quick comment, which was that I think when trying to maybe teach this to parents, that using the same kind of guidance to parents and autonomy giving to parents, when you talk about motivational interviewing, that seems more in the style of what you're, how you're trying to teach the parents to teach the kids, that you also want to teach the parents in that style with autonomy giving rather than telling them you need to do this.
I'm not sure I caught the question, but were you saying don't tell them, let them?
it's like a problem-solving thing with parents rather
Yes.
than telling the parents, you need to do this, you need to
Right.
not do this.
Yes.
So I you know, when you talk about motivational interviewing, that is in that style, but saying like you can't do this or you need to not do this, I don't think that's the best approach
No, I
to
agree,
parents.
I totally agree, and I bite my tongue often in talking with parents about saying corporal punishment is wrong, even though I firmly believe it, largely if for no other reason than children's rights. Children, like all people, have a right not to be hit. But I try to bite my tongue and help them to come to that conclusion rather than telling them that their behavior is wrong. I agree that's not an appropriate way to convince.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay.